So I'm going to use my chair's prerogative, moderator's prerogative, Paswel, to ask you a question about the production side, because you work for the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. You're focused a lot on production. And your presentation had less on that and more on consumption side. I wonder what you're seeing with farmers being able to get access to inputs like improved seeds or fertilizers, and whether they're able to find ways of selling their product. What you're observing on that front.
Yeah, so I think what is happening is, I've seen some people say that a lot of smallholder farmers might weather the storms in the very short term because they're producing their own food. But in the broader sense of the agricultural sector, I think the disruptions in input supply are going to come with a lag. So we are in June. So what happened was when COVID was hitting, a lot of farmers had already, the agricultural season had already started. So kind of the input supply into the farming regions had happened in that sense. However, as time goes by, I'm sure that as the next planting season comes, the next agricultural season comes, it's going to be difficult, and we're going to begin to see the full impacts of the disruptions that are going to happen in global input markets, because we import almost all of the fertilizers, agrochemicals. Some of the seeds are also imported, vegetable seeds, and all that. So I don't think we can make definitive conclusion, as I've seen some people do, that food production is not going to suffer. Maybe in the very short term, because we are relying on food that's already produced. But the disruptions that have happened now will have that lag effect in the months to come. And so I think there's need to do a bit of forward thinking and forward looking in that regard.
Good. So there's a few questions people have raised about markets, and there's something that I touched upon in my presentation on Tuesday. I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit more about food market. You mentioned the chaotic kind of nature of food markets, and that's why they have received extra attention by the public health officials, but that there are these negative consequences of restricting markets. And I wonder if you can tell us about just a little bit more about the nature of those markets and why they're so important from the public health perspective, but then what are these ramifications of the restrictions?
Right. So in one of my slides, which I didn't highlight, I mean, I couldn't talk about every bullet. I talked about bold plans for modernizing the agricultural value chains. So anybody who's been to this part of the world knows that the bulk of the agricultural supply chains are fairly informal. They're not based on contracts and grading and sorting. So everybody gets their produce and just shows up at the market. So there's vegetable over here, there's somebody selling sneakers over there, and there's somebody selling furniture over there. And so it's, it's kind of full of life, if you like. Now, that's not conducive to the situation at hand. So you can't have that go on. So those kinds of markets, I don't know how many in the audience have seen them, but you can Google an African market. I guess you might actually get a picture of how these look. Anywhere in Africa, the capitals, you go to Addis Ababa, Mercato, or you come to Nairobi, you go to Gikomba. They have famous, the famous markets, so to speak, but they're informal. They're spot markets. The levels of public health are not great, as you know, and so maybe this is the time to start. That's why I put that slide over there. That this is the time to start thinking, how do we modernize these markets without displacing people who rely on them for employment and livelihoods? Because one of the things you hear in the literature is, oh, wait a minute, once you start to make these things so rigid and formal and contract-based and grading and all this vertical integration, then you've just shut out lots and lots of people who depend on these markets. I think we can have a middle ground. I don't have ready answers as we speak now, but a middle ground is something we'll have to look for, because they are not conducive to public health. They provide livelihoods, but in a public health emergency, not just COVID, in some cases other public health issues, they are not your allies.
I'm going to sum up a couple other questions. This will be my last question for you for this round, and then I'll move to Sven. About sort of people's beliefs and whether kind of about the causes of COVID and whether they're really understanding the public health messages, or whether there's an information campaign. I think everywhere, even in Canada, there's a lot of focus on providing good information and kind of consistent public health messages to people. And it seems to be easy, as we see with the case of the United States, for that to kind of creep into political terms. And I wonder whether you have an opinion about that.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of people are aware of the dangers of it. I remember early on in March, when I called my mother in the village, she was quite aware of what was going on. My own mother, who lives about 400 kilometers from here, and before they locked down Nairobi, now you can't drive out of Nairobi to another part of the country. So they designated the boundaries around the city, and they said you have to stay here unless you have permission from the police department or something like that, or you are an essential worker with a permit that you've been granted as an essential worker. And she was telling me, but why don't they close up Nairobi? I mean, so the information is there. As you've seen, even in high income or other developed countries that I will not mention now, public communication and compliance is never and so there's always this, people and those sorts of things. There's compliance. As time has gone by and people have seen the seriousness of the issue, there's more and more compliance. There's more and more
you're breaking up a bit, Paswel, so I'm actually going to So Paswel, I'm going to break you off now because
that's contrary to
sorry.
Before March 15.
Okay.
Everybody's opinions.
Okay, Paswel, I'm going to stop the question to you because no, we can't hear you properly. Yes. So I'm just going to suspend that question to you. Okay, I'll move over to Sven. Sorry about that, but it's a technical difficulty. So Sven, there are some pretty highly ranked questions here. I'm just going to actually read through the first one by one to try to get through at least 3 of them.
Okay. All right.
So Sven, in your view, how are consumers thinking of food differently as a result of COVID-19? Do you think that the demand for premium or niche products will return to the levels that they were before the pandemic?
Good point. Difficult question. I don't have a good answer, but I'll try. I'm sure that a lot of households are making adjustments the way they're shopping. We are advised to stay at home and only go once a week. So that alone should affect what people buy. And we have seen that the first things that disappeared after toilet paper were frozen foods, frozen veggies, frozen fruits, frozen chicken, frozen this and frozen that. That makes a lot of sense. So people are more buying longer shelf lives, freezable goods, to make sure that if they cannot go to the supermarket next time around, they are safe and their freezer and fridge is packed. That happens in Kenya, I'm sure, as much, or probably in the same way it happens here. Whether people make other forms of adjustments is more difficult. That is research to be done after the crisis is over. So if somebody faces financial constraints due to unemployment in the COVID crisis, I would suspect that they may be resorting to buying retailer branded products, cheaper alternatives to Barilla pasta and name brand, more expensive items. They may be cutting down on the discretionary chocolate, potato chips, or other things that they typically buy because they can, and now they may think about the extra $3, $4, $5, $10. So the shift away from certain brands to cheaper alternatives, but also people buying more of certain things because they're not going to their Starbucks, or they're not going to their Tim Hortons or other out-of-home consumption. So that's why it's difficult to tease these questions out. On one hand, we see people buy more at grocery stores. We hear that from all the big chains, that sales have been very stellar. But the mix is very difficult to take apart because it will be 1,000 households with 1,000 different profiles of shopping.
Thanks. So we get a lot of, so you've focused on the kind of the income and employment shock of COVID-19 and how that's affecting food insecurity and who may be particularly vulnerable. People ask questions here also. There's a question about the supply side, whether there's been part of the food insecurity may be created by the supply shock. So wonder what role the earlier levels of the supply chain have in creating or preventing food insecurity.
When cities were on lockdown, we closed the border to the United States, other than very essential sort of transactions, the same as in Kenya and Tanzania. I think a lot of people, and I include myself, I was a bit concerned, and there's a lot of debate about potential shortages, mainly due to the inability to get products from producers, from manufacturers onto store shelves. And for somebody who has been following and researching sort of the food supply chain, like you, Brent, and other of my colleagues as well, obviously, I've been astonished by the smoothness of the experience to date, other than the toilet paper crisis, if I can call it that. And yes, there have been, my favorite frozen blueberries have been short in supply. Overall, the retail supply chains have been doing an incredible job in sourcing products and continuing to have them come to the stores. Some products with delay, others much better. So I think we're still yet to see the extent to which maybe supply chains break down, because like in Kenya, agriculture is a seasonal business. And if we run out of certain supplies before they are harvested again, and we all need to remind ourselves, everything that we eat typically comes from a farm, has been planted, raised, grown, and whatsoever. So if the stocks are out, we may face shortages. I don't think there's a high chance we will really see this, but the speculation here in Alberta alone, with the closures of the meat plants, the processing plants, that maybe we'll see some a smaller variety of meat cuts in the grocery store. But I guess we are lucky to be able to say that the disruption of the food supply chains, local, regional, national, and international, has been sort of, I don't want to say minimized, not a good word, but has been mitigated and managed very well. And I think we can count ourselves lucky as opposed to other parts of the world where this may not be given.
Thank you. I'll ask you one more question. And sorry, just a reminder that the next two presentations next week will have a lot more detail about these supply chain sort of issues, value chain issues. My last question for you in this round is about this observation you had. Many people were interested in the observation that only 20% of food insecure households were sourcing food from the food bank. And kind of wondering about the role of food banks then in meeting food insecurity, and especially this, and there was an announcement last week of a new program to try to purchase surplus food from certain industries and make that available as subsidized food through food banks. And we wondered whether you have a comment on the likely efficacy of that type of approach.
So I think food bank frequencies I reported there are based on research done on the 2018 data. I think food bank visits and demand are very volatile. And sort of in a very short term of time, and right now we're seeing that and we hear about it on the radio and in media, that the visits in food banks have spiked quite significantly. And so they had spiked when we had the Fort McMurray wildfires and we are having floods and other sort of disaster events. So they go up and come down. If one averages that out over the year, these numbers are destined to be lower on average. It's not that households go there every day. So We will see after the crisis whether these numbers catch up. I was surprised by myself a little bit through my experience with Meals on Wheels. We see similar patterns in the elderly and frail community relative to the food bank in terms of the frequencies of visits that spike more short term and then go down quicker after this is mitigated. I think the role of food banks in terms of as a vehicle to distribute surplus food or reroute food that is not going through restaurant and food service channels is an interesting thought, but what I've learned through teaching food systems classes and talking to a lot of stakeholders is it's all about the logistics. So I think next week our colleagues Ellen and James are obviously, I'm sure they're going to talk about the essential role that logistics systems are playing in this. Food banks are volunteer-based organizations like many other food organizations and including Meals on Wheels and others. The capacity of these organizations to provide these services beyond playing the role of a hub to distribute to people that come and being delivered by another stakeholder in baskets or pallets is very limited. So I don't think food banks should actually take on the role of a food distribution hub. There are other stakeholders that are much better suited, that have the logistics, cold storage, and other capacities and flexibility of paid expertise and staff to play these roles. I've been hearing stories even before COVID, as the crisis emerged, that somewhere in Manitoba, a greenhouse was sitting on trailers full of English cucumbers when looking for places that could take up these English cucumbers. And that just emphasized the problem that once we have these surpluses, it's very delicate and very difficult to distribute them in a cost-effective way so that the households or the people that receive them can actually use them because they're not expired, and the cost of these systems are managed. So the efficiency of these supply chains that needs to be developed. And if I just can finish on that note, that sophistication that we enjoy in Canada also comes with an inflexibility. And I don't think the food bank gives us extra flexibility in rerouting food supplies to whatever they needed. I think it's part of the discussion of our food system, what needs to happen post-COVID in terms of allowing us to gain that flexibility. And in one way or the other, Paswel, it's also resilience. You know, can your food supply chain be resilient to get food that others may not need to those that need it? The food bank plays a very important and prominent role and will do so in the future, but it's not going to be the one-stop solution.
Okay, given the timing, because I promised we would end within 4 minutes from now, so I'm just going to actually ask Paswel one more question and then thank the speakers. So Paswel, I hope that we can hear you clearly when you respond, but I wonder, we've had an interesting scenario here in Canada and in the United States where the meat packing industry has been a center of infection. So we've had incredibly high infection rates in meatpacking plants, and they have been the place other than seniors facilities, long-term care facilities that have had high infection rates. I wonder about that situation in Kenya or elsewhere in Africa that you've heard.
Yeah, so can I comment on one of Sven's last point real quick?
Briefly.
Okay, very briefly. I mean, Sven, so resilience of supply chains is really critical, and I put it in one of the slides. And one of the things people are beginning to think about is that distribution channels, whether it's of food or some other products, should just look at efficiency and cost as the end game. That the end game should also be resilience. And that's why I thought that in my last slide, I said resilience should be a goal in itself, together with others. Now, talking about food factories, there isn't anything yet in the press, but I think, remember, we are still in the early days of this. That's number one. Number two, we are in early days, and number two, the lockdowns and the ban on social gatherings and all that started with the first reported case. So there's a little bit of a difference in the epidemiology. I mean, if that changes, I think we'll get to hear about it. But I think the food factories are still working. When I go to the shops, I still see the meats and all the other things that come from the packaged areas. But other than that, I want also to add that the bulk of the supply chains, as I said, are informal. So they are not in these concentrated factories with so many people, so to speak, because the people who rely, and Brent, you will correct me, on the formal, very formal supply chains are very few. The vast majority of people rely on the other formal systems we were talking about. So on that score, we haven't heard. There could be that and still not yet out in the press. But I think one of the things that we've learned in this process is that we learn from other people. So as we hear about factories, food factories suffering these kinds of outbreaks, I think they are internalizing those lessons down here as well.
Yeah, and maybe just a wrap-up comment, because I'm also familiar with, as you've hinted, I've had lots of experiences in different parts of the world. I think to think about the different vulnerabilities and the different resiliences that are in different types of food systems. So India, for example, is going to more and more and more of a supermarket model. So that's exposing them to some advantages in terms of food safety, the food safety standards and the and procedures which are put in place in that model, the greater level of regulation, but it also can create bottlenecks like we're seeing where, as Sven said, there's new vulnerabilities in that. So I think as something that we can learn a lot from as this goes forward is what are those vulnerabilities and those resilience points in different systems, and how can they be augmented. So I'm going to stop. I'm not going to give you a chance to respond to that. Thank you very much to Sven and Paswel for these great presentations, and Paswel for staying up late to be with us. And I'd like to thank all of the participants who joined us from around the world for this. I think we have all learned and benefited a lot. There are a bunch of questions people have that we will now gather up and make available through the e-class, as well as later today we'll try to have the recording up in place. Thanks a lot again to Nargiza for facilitating this. Next week we will have 2 sessions, again the same time, same place on the internet, Tuesday and Thursday, focused more on value chains with different commodity groups on Tuesday, and then on Thursday focused on the horticulture sector. So with that, we will bid you good day.
Goodbye. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Paswel.
Bye, everyone.
So I'm going to wait 30 seconds while people are saying their thank yous before I close this.
I get a chance to say thank you to everyone.
This is yeah, you wanted to say hi, Mom, right?
You can say hi, Melanie.
Okay, see you next week.